all for coming, first of all. I know it's kind of crazy with everybody's schedules, and it's a beautiful day outside. At least it's not sweltering yet, so it's sad that you're inside, but I do appreciate you coming. We have recipes over here on the side. We're going to actually make a peanut butternut squash soup. Has anybody ever worked with a lot of butternut squash before? It looks kind of scary if you haven't ever bought it before. It's one of those things you think. It is. You almost need like a good workout to do it beforehand. This is a butternut squash, just in case anybody has never seen one, or you look at it and you say, oh, that looks nice, what is it? This is one of those things that you buy and it sits on your counter for like 3 weeks because you aren't really sure what to do with it sometimes. And they are a little difficult to cut, but we'll touch on that a little bit as well. A little way to make it just a little easier for people when they're trying to cook. But I want to go ahead and get this started. The first thing we're going to do is add some oil to the pan. I'm actually using olive oil today, but you can use peanut oil, whatever you have on hand. Just going to splash it in there. And we're going to get our onions in here and get them going. So I chopped up about half of a large onion, and it really yields almost 2 cups of onion. So I'll just add some of this in while the oil's getting hot. It'd be helpful if I had my little handy dandy spoon up here. Melissa and I spent a lot of time in here today and obviously did not prep anything correctly. Alright. So we're just going to add this in and let that sweat down for a minute. You know what? Onion's good for us. I'm just going to add it all in there.
It's hard to go wrong.
Yeah. It's really hard to go wrong with any sort of veggie in the soup. And I will tell you guys, I love soups. Like 3 weeks ago when I saw the first butternut squash, I made a butternut squash soup. And someone told me I might be jumping the gun a little bit. It wasn't really that time yet. And I say there's never a bad time for any sort of soup once it's September. And it was at least 60 degrees that day, so I felt really good about it. But this is something that's really quick and easy. You can do if you have a family, if you're in a hurry. Actually, even if you don't do an onion that you buy at the store, because I think sometimes just the prepping of things like that kind of deters people a little bit. They actually sell frozen pre-chopped onion at the store. You can get a bag for $1 at Kroger. So you can just go ahead and throw that in and it would be quick and easy. So we're just going to sweat this down a little bit. Now, what we did, because butternut squash can be a little difficult and a little time-consuming in an environment like this, Melissa was nice enough to get up early this morning and she actually took one of the butternut squash, she cubed it, and she steamed it in the microwave. So you said it was about 10 minutes total. She added a little water, and it's a really quick and easy way to do that. So it's already pre-cooked, and then you can just pop it in here without having to wait for it to cook through and soften, which is nice.
Probably I did them in smaller batches, so that like life-size chunks I would put together, and then that would be my only tip.
So how do you peel it?
You want to go through the peeling?
Yeah, so basically, I'll tell you what I do because I'm lazy. If I'm going to roast this in the oven, I usually just cut it in half and slap it on there with the skin still on. And you can almost cut, if you're going to do cubes, you can almost cube it like you would peel out the cubes for an avocado once it's soft. I usually do it for about 350, 45 to 60 minutes depending on how big. This is a small butternut squash. I've seen some out there that are double this size, so it may just take a little longer. Or you can do it with a veggie peeler, and that's really easy because if you try to do it with a knife, there are all these curves that are really difficult, and if you're like me and you like all your fingers, you just want to go the easiest route.
I wondered if a veggie peeler would work. It does.
Yeah, it works really easily.
Okay.
I just get kind of bored peeling stuff like that, so I usually just cut it in half and pop it on the rack for the oven. And I also do that with butternut squash, with acorn squash, with spaghetti squash, any of your winter squash that you want to roast like that. you can roast them all pretty much the same way, which is nice.
So this recipe is for assuming that the squashes are cooked, you know.
It's actually if it's not cooked. So if we just cubed this up, we would have put this in a few minutes ago and let it cook down a little bit more. Cubes this size are probably going to be softened around 10 minutes, I would say. But these are already softened, so I'm going to go ahead and add them in towards the end of this onion cooking so they don't get too mushy. And also, if you have extras, these freeze really easily. It's one of my favorite things. When we did the soup, I had half of a butternut squash soup left. And so the other day, I used half of it, and I just cut the other half in half, roasted it, scooped out the insides, and mashed it up and froze it. So I can use it in pasta sauces, I can use it in mac and cheese, I can use it in whatever I want, but I want to sneak some extra nutrition in there. So we're just going to get this all stirred together. And it's already a little soft, so it won't have to go that long. But we're also going to add some of our other pieces here. So this recipe actually calls for about 6 cloves of garlic. These garlic cloves are really big. So you really get, this is 2 cloves and it was a little over a tablespoon. I wanted to show you guys one of my favorite little tricks while that's cooking up. So these are really difficult to peel sometimes, especially when you throw them on the ground. But basically what we'll do, because these are so big, we're going to get some of our aggression out here. And we're just going to smash down like this. And that helps loosen up some of this extra skin. And you basically just pop the little garlic clove right out. You can also soak them in water while you're prepping your other ingredients, and that helps the skin come off a little easier as well. And then you're just going to chop it up finely. Always watch your fingers here. And I just like to do what I call the rustic chop. It doesn't have to be pretty. Just kind of chop it all in there. And then one of my favorite tricks is I take a little salt and put it on there, and then I kind of massage it around. And after a few minutes, that breaks down the outside of the garlic, and it gets almost to a paste-like consistency, and it releases a lot of that flavor. So if you're going to do that in a soup, I always like to do it because you don't always want those big chunks of garlic in there. And it helps release more of the essence into that as well. That's what happens when you watch Food Network like every day for 2 hours. You learn something. It's called, you know, osmosis, I guess. So we're just going to pop that in there. Garlic doesn't really take that long, just a few seconds, and then we'll add our spices. So I actually have some chipotle chili powder, gives us a little kick. You can add red pepper flakes too if you want. I'm not going to add that much. And then we're going to add some cumin here. Has anybody ever used butternut squash with like black beans and quinoa or anything like that? Yields a really good kind of Mexican-y type flavor. And then we're going to add a little pepper and some salt in here. And I always use salt as a flavor enhancer. I know people think it's a horrible thing, but when it's used in the right amounts, it's really not that bad, and it helps bring a lot of flavors out. So we don't want to forget that piece. So we're just going to let that go here. And now we're going to add the broth. Now, do we have any vegetarians in here? Okay, so we actually got veggie broth, which it calls for chicken broth, but if you're a vegetarian or you're a vegan or you're trying to cut back on your amount of animal-based things, you could easily swap it out for a veggie broth. Quick and easy. This is an unsalted broth, and it calls for about 3 to 4 cups. This box is 4 cups total, so we'll put most of it in there and see what it looks like. And if I don't get this all over me, it will be a good day, I promise. Very rare feat. Alright, so that's about 3.5 cups there. So we'll just bring this up to a boil. And while we're doing that, we're going to add some of the good stuff. Does anyone else think peanut butter should be its own food group? Because if you're like me, I could pretty much sit down and eat this entire jar. Try not to, portion is important. But this has about 3/4 of a cup left in it. This is the natural peanut butter. Natural peanut butters are usually just nuts and salt. They don't use the extra sugars or the added oils, which some people like to stay away from. And peanuts are a good source of our healthy fats. So even though this has a little more peanut butter in there, it's still going to be a healthy source of fats for us. So I'm just going to spoon some of this in here. Try not to eat it since I'm on camera. Too bad. And I don't measure, I just kind of eyeball things and do things to taste. If you're the type of person who really likes to measure, be my guest. I just find that I'm a little too lazy to do that most of the time. Alright. So that looks about right. So we're just going to stir it in there and it'll melt down and it'll give this a really good peanutty flavor as well. That smells really good. Kind of smells like kettle corn and peanut brittle mixed together. Alright. So we're just going to let this come to a boil. And if we need to add a little more peanut butter, we will. Now, for anybody who's made butternut squash before, do you leave your, in a soup, do you leave it whole or do you puree it down or what do you usually do?
Puree.
This is more of a chunky style soup. You could definitely puree this down or puree part of it to thicken it up a little bit. But we're going to leave this more of a chunky style soup. So it adds a little more texture and it's a little different. One of the other things that would be good in this would be adding some like white beans or garbanzo beans if you wanted to up the protein a little bit. This would be a good, entertaining, kind of a side dish or a first course, or you can make it a main meal by adding some of those more plant-based proteins in there, which I know Karen Newton talked about previously. But it's also, I mean, if you wanted to add chicken, you could add that in, really whatever floats your boat. So we're just going to let this boil and let it simmer a minute, and then we will be ready to try it. So when you guys look for squashes and things like that, I had somebody ask earlier kind of what's the difference, why would you use a butternut squash? Really, butternut squash to me is very similar to a recipe that you would use a sweet potato or a potato in. It's a little heartier, it stands up to things like that. It's got a lot of vitamin A, it's a good source of fiber, it's got vitamin C in here. But what I usually like to do, I don't like white potatoes, I just don't like the texture and the taste. So anything I would put a white potato in, for example, like a pot roast, I will use butternut squash instead in the fall since they're abundant, or swap out a sweet potato. Anything that you use like a butternut squash puree or something that is a little more, if you're going to bake or do something like that. If something calls for pumpkin, you could always sub in butternut squash because they're a very similar texture and flavor profile. So there are lots of different ways to kind of sneak these veggies in without people really realizing what's in there. And they're really sweet, which usually people don't mind when things are sweet. They don't ask the question of what's in here. They're just glad to be eating something that they think tastes pretty good. So if you ever make like brownies or cakes or anything like that, you could always swap in like a pureed pumpkin, pureed butternut squash in small amounts, and they probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Has anyone ever tried that or tried any unusual ways to cook with butternut squash? Do you think that after this you'll be able to cook with butternut squash?
I think I'll make a soup for sure.
Yeah, I mean, soup is seriously one of my favorite things ever because it's so quick and easy. You can build these flavors in, 15 minutes, really. And you don't have to do a lot. It's all in one pot. Mm-hmm. Everything you need you could usually pull out of your fridge or your freezer. Mm-hmm. And like I said, one of my really one of the things I highly suggest is for people who live alone, or maybe you have a small family, or maybe it's just two of you, really learning how to freeze these things so that you have them and you can just use them. You know, you can cube this up and freeze it. You can puree it down and freeze it, and it'll stay good for a while, so that way you're saving money, but you're also keeping things that are healthy, that are quick and easy for you to use, which is very important.
Question. I've made butternut squash soup before, but I usually will puree the squash by itself. But should I just make the whole entire soup and puree all that together, or does it really matter either way?
Usually what I do is I puree it all together, but that's just because I like the really smooth texture. So the last one I made, I did squash and carrots, and I roasted them, and like whole garlic cloves and some onion. I just pureed it all because it's a lot easier and I wanted that smooth consistency. If you wanted the base of the butternut squash and then to add other stuff to it that had that heft to it, a little more chunky, you could puree it alone and then add the accompaniment, so it would be more like a, you know, you have tomato-based soups, cream-based soups. That would be more of the base, and you can mix stuff in that gave it more of the texture. And I actually just saw a really good recipe that I'm really excited to try, where she used the butternut squash puree. She made a lasagna with it, like little lasagna rolls. So she used ricotta and butternut squash puree and some mozzarella and some Parmesan, and did it that way, and it provides a lot of nutrition, and it's really hearty and it's still healthy, which is ideally what we like to see. Doesn't always work out that way, but it's really nice when it does. So this looks like it's thickening up, and I will go ahead and get some samples. Would everybody like to try a sample? Okay.
You did. I do an orange soup, which is everything, all the orange veggies that I have. So butternut squash, sweet potatoes, carrots, a little orange juice as part of the liquid. And then that's one that I pureed to make smooth.
Well, and you
it's
know,
really pretty.
Anything, it's one of those things, if you have vegetables that you think, oh, those are probably not going to be edible in a day or two, and you really don't know, you don't want to eat them by themselves, I always just throw them in a soup. They're going to wilt down anyway, nobody's going to be able to tell the difference. And it's a good way to cut down your food waste as well, and really save money and use what you have.
How much nutrition is gone though out of the vegetable?
When you cook it,
Yeah, when it's already old. Is there a lot of
well, it does lose some of its nutrients, but it's still going to contain a lot of that.
Okay.
A lot of times, you know, one of the reasons I really like local foods is usually your food travels around 1,500 miles to get to you, and you're losing vitamin C, you're losing some of those vitamins. It will still have some, but it won't be nearly as much as it did if you bought an apple at the farmer's market and ate it within 2 days. Yeah, that was probably picked a few days ago versus something that was picked in California or Florida or wherever, and then it took 2 weeks to get here, and then it's sitting on a grocery shelf for another week. That's just my personal thing. In terms of nutrients when you're cooking, if you use the cooking water and the cooking liquids that you use, or you don't, you know, steaming things is a really good way to retain a lot of those nutrients as well. But I always just kind of keep some of the water that I cook my veggies down in, and if it's a soup, I'll sub out some of the chicken broth with that, so that way I'm still getting some of that nutrition in there as well.
So. Did you put tomato paste?
We did not put tomato paste. As you can see Melissa's face. We're going tomato free today.
Okay.
Just in case there are tomato allergies or aversions, you know, we just like to make sure everybody's okay. Don't mind the peanuts in here if you have a peanut allergy. We're really worried about the tomato allergies.
If I should add tomato paste.
I would. It'll help thicken it up a little bit. Melissa, do we have spoons as well?
It wouldn't necessarily change the flavor that much.
It might add a little depth of flavor that it won't have right now, and it'll just be kind of a different. I love adding tomato paste to pretty much any sort of soup or sauce, or you know, if you're doing like a stir fry and it's got some different veggies in it and it's not using a lot of soy sauce or things like that, sometimes I'll add a lot of extra tomato paste. That's hot, be careful. But that's a good question. We totally dropped the ball today. No cilantro, no tomato paste. But this leaves it open for creative interpretation. You could crush up some peanuts and throw it on there. You could add cilantro. Actually, basil would probably still be pretty awesome in this. You could really make it what you wanted, which is always nice.
Well, that's soup. It's
Yeah.
never wrong.
Exactly.
Smells like peanut butter cookies.
Yeah, just like peanut butter.
Does it taste
Yeah.
like peanut butter cookies?
I don't think so. I don't.
I hope
Needs
not.
more salt.
A little more salt.
Or maybe the red pepper. Probably red pepper would be better for you.
Well, and I always typically am lighter handed on the spices, especially if there is like a very specific spice like the chipotle powder or the red pepper flakes, because I have been in classes where people are very, they have a big aversion to that. But like Andrea said, this is something you can really make however you want. And you can, if you leave something out, you can throw something else in. And that's really the secret reason I love soups, because that looks like it took forever. And people would be like, oh my gosh, that's so great. How did you do that? And you're like, yeah, it took me a long time. Put a lot of effort into this, when in fact you just steamed some stuff in the microwave and threw it together in a pan and let it sit for a while.
Very good.
Good.
I like it, yeah.
And then they make great lunch the next day.
Mm-hmm. And soup is also one of those things, like you just said, the next day the flavors will deepen. It will be very good. And you can make this a meal, a side. It's quick, it's easy. You pretty much always have onion. You have cumin usually. Most people have peanut butter laying around. A lot of this is stuff that you would probably have at home already, so it's not an extensive list that you have to go out and buy a bunch of stuff just to make it. We like to use what you have, and you could throw some greens in here, you could throw some broccoli, whatever you have that you're trying to use up would be very easy and translatable to this recipe.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Comment.